What's up, everyone? Today we're taking a look at the War of 1812 and we're going to examine the era of good feelings. This is another Joe's Productions video to help you out with all of your history needs. So, important to keep in mind is the War of 1812 initially went very poorly for the United States, and there's a couple of reasons for it. One, the nation was deeply divided. It was opposed by Federalists in Congress and also merchants in the New England region, and our early battles didn't go so well. There was a failed invasion of Canada that was attempted. That was a bust. And some highlights of the war: the British burned Washington, D.C. You could see that image right there at the top. And famously, the British attempted to defeat Fort McHenry in Baltimore, and the United States did not surrender at Fort McHenry. In fact, Francis Scott Key would write the Star-Spangled Banner celebrating that battle. Eventually, the treaty is signed, formally ending the war, the Treaty of Ghent, and nothing was really gained. It's kind of like, it's a stalemate. Pre-war boundaries are maintained. The British got tired of fighting. The war in Europe's over. It's fighting fatigue, and the U.S. really couldn't defeat England, so both sides say, let's call it quits. 2 weeks after that treaty is signed, Andrew Jackson defeated the British at a very famous battle, the Battle of New Orleans, right here on the map. And this kind of marks the beginning of Andrew Jackson as a national figure and national hero. One other thing to keep in mind that happens just as the war is winding down is something called the Hartford Convention. And at the Hartford Convention, some Federalists met to discuss their concerns. They meet in December of 1814, just as the war is ending. They propose some amendments to require 2/3 vote to declare war. They're talking about their grievances about the war and the Jeffersonian leadership. But what also happens at the Hartford Convention at the meeting is some radical Federalists encourage secession. They talk about possibly leaving the Union or, at the very least, signing a separate peace deal with England. This idea is voted down by most of the Federalists at the Hartford Convention. It never really materializes, but it's important to note this is establishing a precedent later used by the South, this idea of secession. We don't like what the government's doing, so we will leave or talk about leaving the Union. Hartford Convention is also the nail in the coffin for the Federalist Party. Even though this idea of secession is not voted on by the members at the Hartford Convention, it is seen as unpatriotic. They are seen as traitors, and we're going to say bye-bye to the Federalist Party as a national party in American politics. Now, following the war, there is this period called the Era of Good Feelings. And really, following the War of 1812, there was a huge increase in nationalism in America. We have survived 2 wars against England. We are gaining respect of the world community. We have new war heroes like Andrew Jackson. In American literature and art, you have American themes being featured by such people such as James Fenimore Cooper. America had begun to industrialize because of all the harassments to American shipping. We had conquered the natives, unfortunately for them. So there is this huge burst of nationalism. And the era of good feelings is really kind of symbolized by the election of James Monroe in 1816. James Monroe easily defeats his Federalist opponent. The Democratic Republicans, the party that James Monroe belongs to, is beginning to adopt some of the Federalist policies. We'll see in just a moment. And in 1820, the next election, you're going to see Monroe is kicking butt. The era of good feelings is a period of only one political party, the Democratic Republican Party. This is the era of good feelings. And like I said, they're starting to maintain some of their traditional principles, but they're also adopting some of the Federalist policies. So historians refer to this as the era of good feelings. Keep in mind, important to note, it's not all good feelings. Even though there is only one political party nationally, you're going to have some conflicts. You're going to have growing sectionalism between the North and the South and the West. They want different things. You're also going to have debates over the American system, which we're going to talk about in a moment. So there's going to be debates over whether or not we should have the tariff, the Bank of the United States, internal transportation improvements. All of these things are going to cause tension within the one political party. And a really big moment happens with slavery. We'll see how that rears its head again. And then you have the Panic of 1819, which really hurts this idea of the era of good feelings. The Panic of 1819 is caused by over-speculation of frontier lands. People are hoping to buy the land for a low price and sell it high, and it really is, the panic is, the first major economic crash under the Constitution. There's widespread unemployment, bankruptcy, imprisonment for debt, and it causes all sorts of problems. And the Panic of 1819 further kind of sours this idea of an era of good feelings. Now back to the policies. The American system is really the idea of Henry Clay. He's a guy from Kentucky. He's a congressman in the House of Reps. And the American system is really the expression of economic nationalism. And like I said, what you're seeing here is national Republicans adopting policies similar to the Federalists. Not all the way, but some, such as the Protective Tariff of 1816. This is the first protective tariff, and you can see on there the reason for it was to protect American goods from British competition by putting this tax on it to make American goods more attractive. It's designed to help American industry and manufacturing. Unlike previous tariffs, this is not intended primarily to raise revenue. It is to protect American industry. There was a fear that England would export a lot of goods to the U.S. and this would hurt a U.S. industry, so this tariff is established after the War of 1812. In order to get other sections of the country to support this tariff, which is going to favor the North and the Northeast, Clay intended to use the money to fund transportation improvements, which will benefit other parts of the country. Another part of the American system is the Second Bank of the United States. This was intended to help ensure financial stability and to provide credit for the nation. The first Bank of the U.S. expired in 1811, and state banks were issuing currency, and the economy was much more volatile. So in 1816, the new national bank, the Second Bank of the United States, is passed by Congress under Henry Clay's leadership. This is going to provide a national currency and financial stability, and it's going to be put in place for the next 20 years. And then finally, the third part of the American system is internal transportation improvements. This is going to be the development of canals, you can see in the green, and also roads, you can see in the red, to link the nation together, especially the Ohio Valley. Not just trade, but also military defense. You're going to connect the interior to the East Coast. Now, even though you have national Republicans adopting some policies that are similar to the Federalist Party, it's important to also keep in mind that Madison and James Monroe repeatedly vetoed proposals to use federal funds on roads and canals. They felt the federal government does not have the right under the Constitution, since it was not explicitly mentioned, to do this, and so they vetoed it. So there still was this kind of idea of a limited federal government, and very often the states had to pay for many of these transportation improvements. The most famous example is New York completed the Erie Canal in 1825, and that's going to be a huge transportation project during this period. All of these ideas under the American system, the tariff, the bank, internal improvements, generated debates over whether the policies were benefiting the North or the South, agriculture or industry, and you have growing sectionalism as these debates are taking place. The big sectional debate, though, during this period is actually going to take place as a result of events in Missouri. Little background for you. Missouri petitions to enter the Union as a slave state. You can see Missouri right there on the map. It is the first part of the Louisiana Territory to try to enter the Union, and it tries to enter as a slave state. Now the problem is, currently, this would upset the sectional balance between slave and free states. There were currently 11 slave states and 11 free states, and this is important for power in Congress, especially in the Senate. The addition of Missouri as a slave state would lead to 12 slave states and 11 free states. There you go, math for the day. An amendment is proposed in Congress called the Talmadge Amendment by a New York representative. It's added to the Missouri bill, and it would have allowed the gradual emancipation of slaves in Missouri. It basically said there would be no more slaves allowed into Missouri, and the children of slaves would be free at the age of 25. And if you kind of follow this to its logical conclusion, that would mean slavery would slowly end in Missouri. The South sees this as a dangerous step towards abolition, and the Talmadge Amendment is defeated in the Senate by Southerners. Well, In comes Henry Clay again with something known as the Missouri Compromise of 1820, and it does a couple of things to try to make everyone happy. First, Missouri will enter into the Union as a slave state. You can see right there. So we'll have 12 slave states, and Maine right over here will enter the Union as a free state. Maine was part of Massachusetts, and it becomes its own state. Third, above the 3630 line, what you're seeing right here, everything above 3630, slavery would be prohibited. And all of this area that had been unorganized as a result of the Louisiana Purchase, no slavery would exist in that region. The Missouri Compromise is hugely important. It temporarily stopped growing tensions, especially with regard to the issue of slavery, but it does hurt the era of good feelings, but it does manage to maintain sectional balance for the next 30 so years. So shout out to Henry Clay. The Supreme Court is really busy during this time period. In fact, right from the APUSH framework, you see the Supreme Court decisions establish the primacy of the judiciary in determining the meaning of the Constitution and asserted that federal laws took precedent over state laws. Really under John Marshall, remember he has a lot of Federalist beliefs, you see the expansion of the government's power through the Supreme Court. Recall Marbury versus Madison in 1803 established judicial review. They can determine what laws are constitutional or not. And you get some other cases such as McCullough versus Maryland in 1819. Basically, the state of Maryland tries to tax the Bank of the United States. They're trying to kind of get rid of the bank, and the court rules a state could not tax a federal agency. The court says the power to tax is the power to destroy, and in the decision they rule the Bank of the United States is constitutional, and it's a dramatic increase once again in the power of the federal government. Another case you should know about is Gibbons versus Ogden in 1824. It ruled that only the federal government, Congress in this case, could regulate interstate trade between different states. The important thing to keep in mind about these John Marshall court decisions is they're all giving more power to the federal government. Even though the Federalists are gone, you see Federalist principles living on in these Supreme Court decisions. Finally, foreign policy developments. Remember, up until James Monroe, it's been U.S. getting picked on by whether it be England or France. Now the U.S. starts to have some stability in foreign affairs and diplomatic success. Really, the guy that's going to be huge during this time period is Secretary of State John Quincy Adams. This dude's like a Jedi when it comes to foreign policy success. You have the Anglo-American Convention in 1818 between the U.S. and England, and it does a couple of things. One, the United States and England agreed to jointly occupy Oregon Territory for 10 years. This was really fertile soil, and the United States and England are going to share it for a period of 10 years. They also set the northern boundary of Louisiana Territory at 49th parallel. There was some dispute about how far the Louisiana Purchase went. They settled it at the 49th parallel. They also agreed to share fishing rights off the coast of Newfoundland. And then finally, you get the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819. The United States acquired Florida. And what you're looking at right there is a young Andrew Jackson. Spain had some problems controlling Florida. There was all sorts of revolutions popping up in Latin America, and they had to send troops to stop those revolutions. Since they couldn't control it, they had all sorts of issues going on there. And Andrew Jackson goes into Florida and goes on a bit of a rampage in 1818. He destroys some native villages, he hung some British people, and he took some Spanish towns. He exceeded his authority, but the U.S. took advantage of it, and Spain gives up Florida rather than losing it for nothing. Finally, the Monroe Doctrine. And this is important. The U.S. feared that Europe would try to recolonize territory in the Western Hemisphere. I mentioned there were revolutions going on in Latin America, and many Latin American countries had gained their independence. And the U.S. is worried, especially that Spain would try to reconquer their former colonies. And we get something called the Monroe Doctrine, actually largely written by John Quincy Adams. It's written without England, and the U.S. warned Europe to stay out of the Western Hemisphere, stay the heck out, leave the new Latin American republics alone, no colonization, no intervention, stay out. The U.S. does agree to avoid European affairs in this, and this is really kind of seen as kind of nationalism manifesting itself in its foreign policy declaration. But the Monroe Doctrine does not have much immediate impact. The US is still way too weak to try to enforce it if anybody challenged it, and the only reason nobody challenged it was because England was down with these goals as well, and England had the Navy. But it is important that you know about the Monroe Doctrine because later on, especially in the 1890s, especially under McKinley and Theodore Roosevelt, the U.S. is going to play a huge role in Latin American affairs, and this is going to sour the relationship between the U.S. and its southern neighbors.
That's all, folks.